This is for the 80% of women who don't feel like they're enough, the 75% of female executives who feel imposter syndrome, and the 91% of girls and women who don't love their bodies. I know that everyone in the world goes through phases of feeling unworthy or unlovable, and we don't rise to what we believe is possible. We settle for what we believe we're worthy of. So this is a little bit about my story. Hi, my name is Raina Cambrai. I've been on a self-healing journey for over a decade, and I've thought about starting a podcast for 3 years and have just been paralyzed in fear and overthinking and in wanting everything to be perfect before I even got started. And we all know the truth is there is no imperfection. And the truth is we all know that there is no perfection. We're all imperfect, and it's about learning to love and accept ourselves. That makes the journey different. So who am I and how did I get here? Well, I was adopted at about a week old. I grew up in New York with my adoptive parents, went to school in Vermont and did all my studying there, and then moved out to Colorado. The reason for this podcast is I have had to do a lot of unlearning. I've had to do a lot of reframing and healing because of the things that I've learned along the way. For instance, being adopted generally leads children to feel like they're somehow unlovable or they're going to be abandoned. And that's a theme that's definitely played a role throughout most of my life. Growing up in New York was actually on my Saturn line in astrology in the sign of Aquarius in my natal chart, which meant that I learned and was forced through very, very difficult lessons from the time I was a baby until I moved out to Vermont when I was 18. And this looked like people having extremely strong reactions to me being confident or me having an opinion or me having big feelings. And it made me feel like there was something wrong with me. So for my astrology nerds and friends out there, I am a Scorpio rising. I'm a Cancer Leo cusp, born on July 20th, the day of oscillation. It's all about change, all about combining the watery, introspective, nurturing, sensitive Cancerian nature with the bold, expressive, confident Leo. My moon sign is also in Leo, Venus in Gemini, and Mars in Virgo. So it's been interesting, and I didn't know any of that information really until probably just before I moved to Colorado about 7 years ago. And then growing up, I always had these big feelings. I was shy in new social situations. I was quick to cry if somebody said something in a tone that maybe hurt my feelings or made me feel unseen, unheard. And I didn't have the vocabulary or the understanding to understand why I felt that way or what was going on. Now, fast forward to college, I initially pursued pre-med, didn't love that, wound up getting a BS in psychology and alternative medicine, and went into those modalities, went into healing touch and massage and psychology to try and figure out what was wrong with me. It was during that time that I actually came across the term and the book from Elaine Aron called High Sensitivity. About 20% of the population is highly sensitive, and you can identify them by the acronym DOES. So depth of processing, overstimulation, that's usually what's noticed by the outside world, a high level of empathy, and sensitivity to subtleties. When I read this book, it was like a permission slip and somebody saying, hey, you're not wrong. You're not wrong for needing a specific environment to thrive. Like, I'm easily overstimulated if there's clutter in my environment. I'm overstimulated or hurt, if the wrong tonality is used in a conversation or even harsh language. And for so long, I felt very alone in that and completely misunderstood. And like, there was really nobody like me. Couple that with being adopted and having an insecure attachment just by virtue of being adopted, but also having parents who were not able to attune to me, and it's not a fault thing now looking back. I think that they did the best with the time, knowledge, and resources that they had. And that doesn't take away from the pain that I felt as a kid, the disconnection that I still feel to this day. And it's because they didn't love themselves, not truly, not internally. They didn't have, like a true high level of self-worth because their parents didn't love them and their parents didn't love them. And so goes back. And so I'm taking it upon myself to stop that and break that generational cycle of self-hate and really move into self-love. And it hasn't been an overnight journey, and it definitely hasn't been easy. By the time I was 17, when I started college, I was diagnosed with major depression, social anxiety, OCD, ADHD, IBS. And these labels that kind of landed on me made me feel less than for a long time. And when I went to get treatment within conventional medicine and with a psychiatrist, there was never a medication or a combination of medications that actually made me feel better. In fact, I was like the person at the end of those TV infomercials on the new medications where they're listing off all the, you may experience, dizziness and heart, nothing combined well in my body. And I had a pivotal moment with a psychiatrist 6 months into college where I was like, hey, like it's been hard for me to go to class. Like I either feel so overly responsive and emotional to somebody having experience maybe like 100 feet away that I'm taking their anger or their sadness on and not being able to like concentrate, or I would feel almost beside myself as an observer and didn't have any reaction to anything, which was also equally jarring for me as a person, who is highly sensitive and used to being in her body and feeling these big emotions. There was a moment in that meeting, that consultation, where he said that it was my fault for not coming to see him sooner. And I just like looked at him and walked out and stopped everything cold turkey. I tell everyone transparently, don't do that. That was my decision at the time, but I definitely experienced some pretty extreme side effects as a result of doing that. When I went home for winter break, my mom, who's a therapist, was like, well, you can't just do nothing. So I started reading. We both started reading, started researching alternative treatments for ADHD, for all the things that I was experiencing. And there was a local practitioner, Dr. Richard Brown, who specializes in ADHD and alternative treatment. And the thing that was the most impactful for me was something that he calls the total breath, which combines 3 different types of breathing: the ujjayi or ocean breath moving, which is visualizing your breath moving up and down your spine, and then coherent breathing, which is just a fancy word to say your inhalation and your exhalation are of equal length at approximately 6 breaths per minute. Now, within doing this practice for 2 weeks, and mind you, I'd been in psychotherapy for years. I was now going to school for it. I feel like I did a lot. And within 2 weeks of doing this breathing meditation, my anxiety was gone. Not lessened, the anxiety was no longer there. And I started to have, bubbly kind of tingling sensations of actually being in my body. So I spent the next, so many years learning more about these practices. I went and trained in like 6 different types of yoga. I got my massage therapy license. I trained in healing touch and energy medicine and craniosacral. And all of these brought a little piece of myself back. I think that when we come in as babies, we have no question of how worthy we are. We have no question that we're lovable, that we deserve to express ourselves and be attended to and given attention and intention. And somewhere along the way in our childhoods, we download these programs from the adults around us, from society, from peers, from teachers, that instill the belief that something about us is wrong, something about us is not enough. And so the past, now 12 plus years have been a journey of taking that shattered glass that was my soul and finding those stained glass pieces and, creating a piece that's actually really beautiful and offers, even more color, even more depth, even more breadth. And yet it wasn't without pain. And there are still days where I feel sad and lonely and out of place. And I know that if just a few things had been different in my environment, if high sensitivity was something that was more commonly known by the wider public, I may have been treated differently. I may have had the environment, the support, the praise, the feedback that I needed to truly thrive. And that's essentially what my journey has been, in these past 10 years, is finding hundreds and hundreds of tools so that in any given moment, I have the choice to start tapping through something, that I have the yoga practice that's actually going to ground me and make me feel more embodied, that I have the tool of nonviolent communication to be able to communicate to people in a way that diffuses the anger, the frustration that they might be feeling, so we can actually have a heart-to-heart conversation. Healing touch to, clear through energetic blocks, emotional blocks, and make more space for the person that I wanted to become. And I'm grateful for the journey. I'm grateful for where I am today. I'm always a person who will admit to there's always more work to do. Nobody is perfect. I'm aware of my blind spots, my areas for improvement. I'm open to reflection from the people around me. And yet it's been painful. There has been a lot of grief and loss, starting with that initial loss of being adopted and not feeling at home in my family, to having a lot of upheaval in my relational life. Now, a part of that, if we put it in the lens of astrology, is growing up on my Saturn line. That's the karmic teacher. And then we couple that with my Saturn being in Aquarius. Well, that's about community. That's about, breaking out of the norm, not doing things in a conventional way, thinking about the bigger picture. So I never really fit in. And I remember when I first went to elementary school feeling, overwhelmed by the amount of people that were just in the school. And I also remember receiving feedback from my mom, from teachers, feeling concerned that I didn't have, friends, that I wasn't fitting in, that I wasn't speaking up. And from a conventional perspective, not having the lens of high sensitivity or astrology, not knowing that Cancer as a sun sign is a super sensitive sign, or that highly sensitive children take longer to process information because they're not just processing a word. They're processing the amount of people that are there, the feelings the people might be having, the clothing that they're wearing, the physical environment, the movement of the people. And they're processing it on such a deep level that sometimes, yes, they can appear as shy. But in fact, they're not shy. They're just processing. And so if I had had that acceptance, that knowledge from an adult, I might not have felt so weird. But what wound up happening was, of course I wanted my mom to feel okay. I wanted to feel loved by her. I just started saying something for the sake of saying something because it became very clear to me that that's what people needed me to do. And what wound up happening as a result of that is saying something for the sake of saying something became a compulsive lying habit that didn't really get addressed until a friend in the first year of college sat me down kindly. And this is the important key for people who are highly sensitive or who know someone who's highly sensitive, is that if the information, especially in childhood, is presented in an aggressive way, in a harsh tone, the highly sensitive child may not even be able to receive that at all. And so this friend sat me down and she explained to me why we weren't going to be friends anymore, because I had this habit of lying. And when I sat down with myself, I was like, okay, well, why am I doing that? Well, I was doing it because I didn't know who I was. I felt like who I was and what I felt was so unacceptable, was so outside of the norm, that there was nobody like me that I could talk to or relate to, that, of course, I just wanted to fit in. I just wanted to belong. We're wired for connection and love and belonging, and especially from our parents. And so I have so much compassion for that part of me, that inner child, that young self that made that decision to say something for the sake of saying something, just to fit in. But it was definitely a hard lesson. And I think I knew almost instantaneously, being conceived, being born into this world, that I was sensitive, that the world was loud, that a lot of people had big, heavy feelings that they didn't want to address. I always joke with, some of my spiritual friends. I'm like, where's the contract? Where did I sign up for this level of contrast? From a very young age, though, I began taking on my parents' emotions. Even to this day, there's still a lot of stuff that is under the surface that neither of them have addressed. And it manifests as, physical clutter and like hoarding in the household. It manifests as lethargy. It manifests as, a pattern with alcohol. And that was really hard for me as a highly sensitive child. And I've only realized recently what I had to do was essentially shut off my needs. I am an empath in many, many ways. And I have a talent, now it's a conscious talent that I cultivated through different modalities of energy healing, but I have a talent for taking in neutral and negative energies, being able to transmute them and output positive energies. And so seeing my parents stressed out, feeling the conflict in the household over food or money, or just, day-to-day disagreements of how differently they live their lives and how different I am from how they want to live their lives. And I felt, without words to express, that they couldn't meet my needs, that they could not emotionally attune to me, step into the puddle of what I was feeling, and take me as a part of themselves to the point where they could consider my needs on equal level. That's not something that they knew how to do intuitively, and it's not something that they learned, even to this day. So I, absorbed a lot of stuff for them, and I basically had to shut off my own needs. So it makes sense that in tandem, I was also kind of lying in school, because I just wanted their love. I wanted to feel safe. I mean, as a child, if you don't have the love and the care from your parents or caregivers, of course you're going to feel threatened, like you're in a little baby body, in a little child body. You don't have the autonomy and the freedom and the control to be able to take care of yourself. And so that was the safe route at the time, was to turn off my own needs to be able to receive whatever love they could give, and to not hate them. Because if I was conscious at that point that I basically had to put my needs to the wayside and on a table to make things okay for them, I would have hated them. And it's only really recently that I've come into that realization that I was doing that for so long because I so desperately wanted their love and acceptance. And that theme, I think, has also played out in my relationship life. And I've had a lot of friends, I've had a lot of lovers, kind of come and go, where maybe I wasn't always portraying my truest self because I didn't know who that was. I didn't have the environment or the container to even explore, who that Raina might be. And it's only been in the last few years that I've truly been able to step into my authentic power and have had people around me who can see me and validate me and honor me and lift me up for who I authentically am and not who they want me to be. So I've cultivated a lot of tools along the way, and my intention for this is to give back. I love talking, I love spreading knowledge, I love being a resource for people, and that's what I did in my private practice for many years. So if you're a friend, if you're a new viewer and you have a question about self-care, if you have a question about, how to deal with a big feeling, let me know. I'd love to answer and give you some of the tools that have worked for me or clients along the way. And how did I get here to sharing this podcast to where I am? Well, that journey, that inkling of wanting to heal myself led me into a career of being a healer and blending psychology, yoga, energy healing, massage, cupping, astrology, kind of all into one to help people have these very transformational sessions. And I believe that in order to be a healer in any capacity, you need to walk your talk. And I feel this way because I had a mom who didn't always walk her talk. I remember there was a time when I was a child and she would tell me that I was negative and I needed to say 3 positives for every negative thing that I said. But then I noticed she didn't do the same thing. So why should I? And so when I was in my private practice, for each hour that I spent working with somebody, I would probably spend 4 to 5 hours on my own self-care, whether that was physically taking care of myself, energetically, going to therapy, doing mindset work, reading, continuously improving myself to be the best resource that I had, because not every single tool works for every person because every single person is different. So I always wanted to make sure that I had a plethora of things to suggest to help people really create the changes that they want. Fast forward though, 12 years, because I started my private practice in tandem with when I started college. I got to go to school in a place where you didn't need a license to practice massage or energy healing. So while I was in school, I just started practicing. I burned out. And I didn't know I was burning out at the time, actually. Right before I burned out, I was running on what I would qualify as such a high that people were like, oh my God, like you have superhuman energy and like you're going and going and going. And nobody in my life, not my mom, not my friends, not my therapist or energy, nobody recognized that I was actually running on cortisol, that I was in the last stage of like exhaustion where you're just kind of like, going and going and going before you crash. And so it looks like, you're kind of on this high and do have superhuman energy. Then about 2.5 years ago, my partner at the time moved in and I completely crashed. It was like my nervous system recognized that this person was safe enough and my environment was safe enough to show up all these things that I was blinded to, that I couldn't address because I didn't have the safe environment, the safe relationship that I needed to do so. And that was hard. That was really hard. I felt depleted. I felt exhausted. And honestly, I felt really embarrassed because after over a decade as a healer helping others, I was now the one needing help. And that was a hard edge for me. It took me nearly 6 months just to be okay with the concept of rest, without feeling an immense amount of guilt that I wasn't producing or providing something, to be able to rest for another about 12 months. And that's when, the adrenal burnout really reared its head. It's when hormonal dysfunction, showed up in my life. And I had to change how I was living, how I was going about my day, the things I was eating, the water that I was drinking. And that was about, a 1.5 year journey to get to where I am today, to where my energy is back. And I'm so grateful for it. It feels so good to be able to move my body again, to be able to pour my energy into the passion projects that are important to me, like hydrogen water and learning about sales, but in a more feminine way that aligns with products and services that nurture, and has a process of getting to know potential people in a way that feels nurturing and disarming. So it's been life-changing. I'm definitely always still on my journey of learning how to improve. And I've cultivated a sense of feeling worthy of self-expression, feeling worthy of the amazing friends that I now have in my life that uplift me and support me and inspire me and have encouraged me to start this podcast and write a book. Don't worry, that's coming. And there are still the edges. I'm going through a separation with somebody that I've loved for a long time. And I've come into the awareness and accepted finally that we just have some incompatible needs. Maybe for right now, maybe forever. Only time will tell. I only have control over who I am and what I'm doing. I can't control him. But the thing that gave me the push that I needed to really start was actually a book that I've been reading. A book that, I think should be required reading for all women, for anybody who feels like they don't measure up in some way. It's Worthy by Jamie Kern Lima. And it really has taught me how to believe that I'm enough and how to transform my life. And that doesn't mean that I'm 100% sure of every step, but it does mean that I'm willing to take that step forward. It does mean that I'm willing to reach out in the times when I feel vulnerable, when normally I would just go inward and handle everything myself because that's what is safe. That's been my program. It does mean that I'm willing to do the hard work of reflecting on my own personal habits and mindset patterns and behaviors that have been hurting me or have hurt other people. And it does mean that I'm willing to put the work in to create the kind of life that gives me that emotional equanimity, that gives me that financial freedom, that gives me that flexibility to travel. So if you're out there listening, if you've heard my story, thank you for giving me your attention and your intention. I'd love to know what you want to know more about, whether that's astrology or self-care or self-expression. And I thank you for being here. Have a good week.